Greetings, my lovelies. This is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Independence Day Resurgence. So, I really regret not revisiting the first Independence Day prior to the release of this sequel, because I loved the shit out of that movie when I was a kid. When it first came out, I watched it over and over again, much to the irritation of my parents. I collected all the toys, I played the crappy video games. It had a huge impact on my childhood. And yet, I haven't really felt the desire to watch the film again as an adult. And I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe part of me just feels like it would be redundant, because even if I can't really remember the quality of the overall movie, I do remember a lot of what occurs within it. I can recall most of the content, so it just almost seems redundant to check it out. But then maybe I also am afraid that it hasn't aged well, so all I'd be doing is tarnishing a childhood memory. But usually whenever a film is being rebooted in any way, shape, or form, whether it's some kind of sequel or a flat-out remake, I will check out the originals just so I could brush up on my feelings and can make an accurate comparison. So when Mad Max Fury Road was released, I was sure to revisit the Mad Max trilogy. When the upcoming Ghostbusters reboot comes out, I will have definitely seen Ghostbusters 1 and 2, even though I've seen the movies in the past. It's been so long, and I need to update my opinion so I can make an accurate comparison. But with Independence Day, I chose not to do that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I think the reason why I skipped Independence Day this time around had less to do with the first film and more to do with the sequel. Because when this project was first announced, I wasn't really excited or concerned. I was completely indifferent. I could not give a shit about Independence Day 2, because as much as I loved it as a kid, and whether or not the film has withstood the test of time, Independence Day was just not the kind of movie that needed a sequel. And if it did, they should have struck while the iron was hot and not waited until the film sort of faded out of our collective memories. It's become rather irrelevant as of 2016, and Independence Day was a huge hit when it was first released, but it hasn't had a real enduring legacy. You don't hear people talking about it very often unless Roland Emmerich has another new release and people are eager to make some form of comparison. You don't really see its influences in current films or any kind of medium, whether it's comics or books, video games, whatever. So when they choose to reboot something like Star Wars or Jurassic Park, you can understand why they do that, because those films are still fresh in our memory. And I'm talking about the original films, not any more recent sequel. Even the likes of Blade Runner and Tron and Ghostbusters, people still talk about them, people still think about them, whereas Independence Day just we thought about them and we thought about it and talked about it back in the 90s, but not really these days. So I bring all of this up because I wanted to emphasize that I thought a sequel was unnecessary. My expectations were going to be low. The excitement going into it was going to be minimal. And I can't really accurately compare this to the original, for better or worse, because or at least I can't compare it to the original with confidence, because for all I know, if I dislike the film, I could go back and watch the first movie and realize that that wasn't very good either, and I disliked these movies for the same reasons. Or I could say it is a worthy sequel only to go back and watch the original and realize that it wasn't, that the original was a lot better. So keep all of this in mind while I am discussing Independence Day Resurgence. So, what did I actually think about this movie? It was okay, I guess. It's exactly the kind of movie that you think it's going to be, in that it's heavy on spectacle, low on substance, but so was the first film, so you have to start off with that to determine, does this sound like the kind of movie that you will enjoy? So let me bring up my notes, and I will go through this film point by point, and you just have to decide yourself whether or not you think this can provide entertainment for you. I was pleasantly surprised at how much I enjoyed myself, even if I can't call this film good by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it's much closer to being a bad movie. So let me start off with what I liked. The visuals were stunning. The special effects weren't quite flawless. There were a few points where the CGI wasn't convincing enough, but usually I was taken aback by how great the CGI effects looked. One area I was not thrilled about going in was how this movie was going to be almost completely digital, whereas the first film had a strong combination of CGI, which was revolutionary during that time period, and practical effects. They built models to destroy, and I personally prefer that kind of filmmaking because it requires more cinematic technique. The director, cinematographer, editor, they are just as important in those scenes as the special effects wizards. But when a film is relying almost entirely on CGI, well, then the director usually uses a lot more second unit work, and now you're relying a lot more on the special effects people. And to me, it just doesn't feel quite like cinematic expression. I can get the same effect in a video game. You don't have to agree with me there, but that is merely my opinion on this subject. But while I was watching Independence Day Resurgence, I was taken aback by how cinematic the movie looked, despite the fact that it probably was almost entirely shot in front of a green screen. There were times when I was thinking to myself, wow, this cinematography is breathtaking. I love the use of eye-popping colors. I love the sense of scale. The alien crafts look so huge, and I couldn't figure out whether they've gotten to a point where the cinematographer, director, and editor, they could get more involved in the special effects oriented scenes, or if the special effects wizards have simply gotten so good at their craft to where they could pretty much function as cinematographers, directors, and editors. Either way, my breath was constantly being taken away. I thought this film looked stunning, and the action scenes were exciting. I have no complaints with this film on that level. Well, now we got to get into some complicated areas, though, because as phenomenal as Independence Day 2 is on a spectacle level, will this imagery hold up as well on the small screen? Because when a movie emphasizes the scale, that means it's designed for the theaters, and I can't imagine how great this would have looked on the IMAX. But if I saw this on my television, I'd probably be a little underwhelmed. So that's another thing you need to take into consideration. Is this film worth paying to see in theaters? And at the same time, you have to consider that it probably is going to provide the best possible experience in the theaters. I don't think you're going to feel that same impact on the small screen. And that is one thing that the first Independence Day did surprisingly well, is that the visuals actually translated very well onto the small screen. The imagery was a lot more memorable. I mean, who can forget the scene of the White House being destroyed? That just wasn't a good special effect. That was some great cinematic technique there. And while I was impressed by most of the visuals in this movie, I don't think I'm going to remember any of them for a long period of time. There's not going to be that one iconic image that's going to define the movie. So that is another thing to consider. Another aspect of Independence Day 2 that I really admired was that it had mostly new content. It's not relying entirely on nostalgia, which puts it ahead of Jurassic Park. Or not Jurassic Park, Jurassic World, where the entire movie is built around reminding us how cool the original was. Yes, there are a lot of callbacks in Independence Day 2, but for the most part, they've thought of new scenarios for our characters to find themselves in, new kinds of action sequences. It's just not a constant reminder of the first film, and I really, really respect that, especially as Independence Day Resurgence could have very easily been that kind of movie, considering Roland Emmerich is no Colin Trevorrow. So that's another reason why I did enjoy this film, is I got a lot of new content. I will also say it's a very fast-paced movie. It's not as long as I was thinking it was going to be. It's about 2 hours long, but it gets going almost immediately and never stops, never slows down. But on the other hand, you could argue that it's just trying to get itself over with, and therefore that's part of the reason why nothing's going to stick within my memory for a long period of time, because it's moving too fast for anything to really resonate that strongly. One aspect of the first film that I really liked was how it kind of had a slow burn build at first, where the alien spaceship shows up. It's now focusing on everybody's reactions to it, but they build up to that first major clash, making it a lot more exciting when it finally happens. It gives us a stronger payoff. Here, it's like the aliens show up and the action almost immediately begins. So it's just nowhere near as effective. Now, they do try to defy our expectations with one subplot, but it's very clumsily handled and rushed through to where they may as well not have even bothered. I respect the creativity behind the idea, but it was just badly handled. And speaking of which, the film actually does have some pretty novel concepts. I liked how they incorporate the alien technology into our own. So when we're seeing our technology, it looks a lot more advanced. And I personally could tell the difference between our ships and the alien ships. I've heard some complaints that it made the action scenes kind of incomprehensible because you couldn't really tell who was fighting who. I didn't have that issue, but you might. But still, I thought that was a really neat idea. And that pretty much is where I have to stop being kind towards this movie, because it's really dumb. It's so dumb, with many eye-rolling moments of plot-induced stupidity where you're like, no, that's like the most unreasonable thing you could possibly do. There is no way that shit would happen in real life. But where I thought the film really started to screw up was with its characters. And there's just way too many characters in this movie, and most of them lack any kind of purpose. Now, first Independence Day was also an ensemble piece with many characters that probably could have been cut out as well, but it seemed like in that film they prioritized things a lot more evenly. So you had your three main characters, Will Smith, Jeff Goldblum, and Bill Pullman. Then you had a bunch of supporting characters who I have to put the emphasis on support. They were there to help define the main characters and give them different personalities to play off of. And then you had a lot more minor characters who pretty much functioned the same way. Here, I think they're trying to do what Star Wars did, in that they're putting a lot of emphasis on the original cast, but they're supposed to be putting over the newer cast, who ideally will carry the remainder of this potential franchise. But it's handled very badly. I liked how The Force Awakens used its old cast in relation to the new ones. Here it's like they're trying to give too much screen time to the older cast, but that only really draws more attention to how much more interesting they are than the newer cast members. And the newer cast members have such weak character arcs and bland personalities that they don't really stand out at all. And it's weird because I kept thinking that Will Smith's character's son was supposed to be the protagonist. He has the real vendetta against the aliens, but he almost seems like an afterthought in his own movie. And it really hurts that, I mean, the actor isn't bad, but he lacks the charisma of Will Smith. And it really feels like they're trying to write this character as if he's being played by Will Smith half of the time. And I think a better decision would have been to write the character as if he is very insecure about living in his father, or was it stepfather's shadow. That would at least have made me less likely to compare the two. But as such, I thought he was a very weak protagonist. It was more like Liam Hemsworth's story, but I don't know. Liam Hemsworth never really seemed to have the emotional stakes to really function as the main character. Yeah, he's constantly in peril, but he's constantly making jokes. He never really seems all that concerned about what's going on around him. Whereas, like with Will Smith's character, when the people around him were dying, he seemed furious. He seemed devastated. Even if, yeah, he could turn that into humor, there was more of an edginess to it. Whereas with Liam Hemsworth, it lacks that edge. It's almost as if like he's not really processing everything that's going on around him. Plus, it seemed like Will Smith was at least trying to get to his. I don't remember if they were married or just engaged or what. Actually, I think they were just engaged, or they were maybe just boyfriend, girlfriend. I don't remember. But he was trying to get to her. And since she was in peril, you felt a lot more emotional depth there. I mean, at least the stakes were a lot higher. Yeah, Liam Hemsworth, he's engaged, but that character never really felt like she was in any kind of danger, even though she is very prominent too. So it's like that whole subplot seemed meaningless. Speaking of meaningless, what was with the estranged relationship between him and Will Smith's character's son? They're feuding for stupid, petty reasons, and it's such a small and insignificant subplot that they could have easily removed it and it wouldn't have lost anything. It was just a clumsy, half-assed attempt at dramatic tension. And I kept thinking to myself, why was the warlord here? Yeah, he was badass and cool, but totally pointless to the narrative. Why was that goofy government suit there who was just kind of hanging out with the warlord? I know he's supposed to be funny, but he really added very little to the story. And I found myself thinking this about most of the cast. Jeff Goldblum's new love interest, totally superfluous. His father really did not need to be here. The kids that his father interacts with really did not need to be here. Most of the cast did not need to be in this movie. Now, maybe if I watch the original film, I'll feel the same way. But at least based on memory, it seemed like that film did a much better job with its cast. Furthermore, it did a solid job at highlighting the cast's strengths. If an actor was charismatic, you would really get that feeling with like Will Smith or Bill Pullman. If the character is supposed to be quirky, they would really emphasize that. So Jeff Goldblum, Will Smith, and Bill Pullman were able to stand out in that movie, and they were all able to play off of each other very well. And the supporting cast only reinforced that. Here, it's like everybody just going off in their own different directions. The cast really isn't complementing each other. And nobody's, other than maybe Jeff Goldblum, who doesn't need to stand out, is standing out. So that was a major problem with the narrative of this movie. Another issue was death seems cheap here. In the first film, when an important character would die, you would feel that sense of tragedy. You would see their deaths and the actions of their loved ones. It would be etched on their faces. So you really got that impression, like when Bill Pullman's wife dies. You never completely forgot about that throughout the remainder of the movie. Here, Independence Day 2 is willing to kill off important or seemingly important characters, and it's willing to kill off characters from the first movie, except it seems like whenever they die, there would be a scene where they'll be mourned very briefly, and then it's like they're forgotten about. And so none of the deaths really had any kind of impact for me. In fact, I sometimes have to remember, oh yeah, that character did die in a heroic sacrifice near the end, and yet it's just sort of upstaged by what happens next. So where you almost completely forget about that character dying, even though they were one of the most important characters of the movie. And this might be because of the tone too. The tone is very inconsistent. The first film, it seemed like it was a lot more lighthearted, but at the same time, it made a point to keep the stakes high, so you would feel that suspense that, you know, everybody is in peril, but that was merely part of the film's entertainment value. Here, it wants to take itself a lot more seriously, so the tone is a lot bleaker and more gritty, which only makes the goofy comedic moments seem very out of place. Now, this film has a sense of humor that sometimes works, sometimes fails, but it seems like it was fit for the 90s, and a lot of the 90s style of comedy just doesn't work in today's world. It seems a lot cornier by today's standards, and it just constantly was taking me out of the moment. Like, there's this very, very sad, tear-jerking scene near the end when a character loses their significant other. And I was surprised, you know, how effective that was, considering these were two relatively minor characters. And then almost immediately afterwards, the survivor is reverting back to their old goofy self, where they're making jokes and supposed to be funny. And it's just, how am I supposed to feel anything when the movie is constantly overriding its own drama? So the tone was another major issue with Independence Day Resurgence. And that's really all I have to say. The film is kind of a mess, a sloppy train wreck, but at the same time, it always managed to keep me entertained on some level. It's the type of film that, if you think about it, it's really fucking stupid, but it does provide eye candy, and I'm the type of viewer who will latch onto anything I can to possibly enjoy myself. If I flat out dislike a movie, it's because it really has no redeeming attributes that I could hold on to. But a lot of people aren't the same way as me, so they might just see, yeah, the film looks good, but it's a piece of shit otherwise, and they might not like it. Thoroughly understandable. So you have to, once again, consider your own tastes and make your own decision as to whether or not this movie is for you. So that's all I have to say. I did not do a written review, but I did do a written review of Lady Snowblood, so please read that. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and I shall see you guys later.